Tim, it sounds
All right.
like you are going to be good friends here soon.
All right, we're going to move on then to item C, old business, sea level rise resiliency adaptive management plan. And I think I've got a new cast of characters who are going to be here. We don't have a presentation. I emailed out to all of the council members here a recommendation or an outline of an approach for next steps in addressing sea level rise, which was put together by a group which includes both members of the original sea level rise subcommittee of a couple of years ago, as well as some new individuals that have joined that group since. So we've got Jim Chitwood, Jack Kontz, we've got John Leffler, Kathy Pumphrey, David Pumphrey, Lucas Hernandez. You know all of these folks, and I don't know, I think the only one that's probably not on our call is John was not going to be, John Leffler. And Kathy, is David with us today or not? I don't know.
Yep, he's right there.
That one's in the background. So.
We're doing it together.
Yeah. So, look, I sent you this document, and I'm going to try to summarize. We're not going to do a presentation, but we really, this group and I need a sense of direction. And so we received from the short term, or from the sea level rise subcommittee, almost 2 years ago, what I think was a spectacular document. Study, which I think did two things, or maybe did three things. One, I think it really crystallized and made the case for the entire community, and certainly for the town council at that time, that sea level rise was an issue that we needed to be concerned about, regardless. And I think they tried to take the politics out of it. They tried to take a lot of the social media debate out of the issue of sea level rise, and I think made a case to say, especially for a coastal community like us, we need to seriously consider and think about the long-term impact that this might have. I also think they helped us better think about what the range of that impact could be over a number of years. And lastly, I think they helped us narrow down for our community what some of the key consequences could be. And you're seeing that in some of the things that have happened over the last year, whether it be Kika's recent recommendation and the work that they've been doing, which Lucas has been behind, which is to really get a handle on drainage, flood management, and the changes that Kika needed to do to better address and deal with their drainage infrastructure. Two of the presentations that you saw here a minute ago from Lee, I think have been driven directly from that work, and the recognition that as a community where the natural environment is the key part of our brand, that we needed to be concerned about the long-term impact of sea level rise on our natural environment, and particularly the impact that it would have on our marshes. And so I think it's clearly had an impact both on the community association, on Kika and their board, on the Conservancy and others on the island. The question, though, that I certainly raised to this group early in the year is, okay, what have we accomplished? Which I think is, what have they accomplished, which is a lot. But where do we go next? And the fact is, we've grabbed some low-hanging fruit. We've got a lot of projects going on. But what happens down the road? This is not a 2-year thing. We don't create a 5-year plan. This is something that we need to be focused on and thinking about for a number of years. How do we go about doing that? And so what you have in front of you is an approach, a model. They call it adaptive management. It was actually addressed. I mean, you'll see this laid out in their original report back from 2 Octobers ago. But I think it's described in greater detail here. But it's an approach which, without getting into, I'll let them, they're on the here and they can answer all your questions and get into the detail. But it's an approach which basically tries to start by identifying what are the key things down the road that we don't want to see happen as a result of sea level rise, if sea level rise happens. What would be the negative impacts on the community? They term those thresholds, but it's trying to better identify whether you're a property owner, a business owner, a homeowner, what are the potential impacts and results of sea level rise that we do not want to see, that we want to avoid? Because if we don't avoid them, it's going to impact either the brand, it's going to impact quality of life on the island, it's going to impact our commercial interest, it's going to impact our property values. Their model then says, if you've identified those things, how do you then begin to quantify and identify what are the levels? How do you know when those are starting to reach a problem level? What are the points in which flooding is an issue, or salinity changes in the marshes are going to jeopardize your marshes? And then how do you put in place a process to monitor those things and then create plans and approaches to deal with that? And I'll ask, that's my summary. Jim, is that a accurate enough summary of your model?
Yeah, I think that's quite good. It is adaptive, so that the key thing that we gain, in addition to being alert and planning for and doing the right things when we need to do them, is that we get to observe what's going on. How fast are things changing? What new technology is there? The plan we had in place tentatively to deal with X or Y or Z, are there better options now for dealing with it? And can we spread the money and everything out over time? So it is adaptive, but the key thing is we need to put in place this concept so that we are alert and ongoing, whether it's 10 years after I've quit doing sea level rise or whatever, that it's ingrained in the system to pay attention to this in a useful and helpful way.
And so I think it's a good model. There's probably a dozen other ways you could approach that, but this is one that I think has been put in front of us. And I think it makes, conceptual sense. It's doable. And from my own perspective, I think that we need to have some sort of approach in place that
Exactly.
that brings some momentum, because again, town council changes, town council makeup changes, KICA board changes, and I think will be problematic if every new council, every new board is starting from scratch to say, okay, now, how do we want to go about thinking about sea level rise, and how do we go about creating a plan? That the one constant we can have is to adopt an approach that I think can help all of our organizations work together in sync to think our way through how we identify and adapt to sea level issues. So the first point is, I think they have a good model, and it's one that I would encourage the town council to adopt, but I'm going to lay that out there in a second. The second thing, which I want to stress, and then I'll leave it to them to talk and the town council, is as part of that model, the very first step would be to step back and identify these thresholds, which are essentially what are the key issues that we're trying to track that we want to make sure we don't want to have happen. And that, for example, are, I think, some of the kinds of things that we talked about in the earlier presentation. We don't want to see the marshes die. So what are the thresholds? What do we need to do to make sure that we're monitoring, tracking, and understanding when they're at risk? or we don't want to see, groundwater salinity change to where our trees are impacted. So I think the first step that they're describing is an effort that would have them over the next couple months getting. Well, the one thing that we've missed so far is that we've been basically telling our residents what they ought to be concerned about and thinking about on sea level change. What we haven't done is gone out to our residents and said, and our stakeholders, our businesses, and said, okay, what are you concerned about? Are you concerned about the natural environment? Are you concerned about your property values? Are you concerned about drainage? Are you concerned about transportation? So what they're recommending are a couple different approaches that would entail going out over the next few months, doing some focus groups, getting some input from our residents, our stakeholders, having that result in some sort of a survey, which ultimately then could be combined with all of the work. And what I'd like to see is that the result of that brought back both to the KICA board, to the KICA board and to the town council in the November timeframe. And in so doing that, this council would have the opportunity to basically put its imprint on that first stage of the adaptive model, and really then put a new town council in a position to move to the next step. So what you've got there is their recommendation, a couple options. What you've heard from me is, because I feel strongly on this, is my perception that I think what they're recommending here makes sense. I'd like to see them actually do this, but my sense from all of my conversations is that for them to do that, they need to know that the KICA board and the town council are supportive and would like to see them spend the time, resources, and work to take on that project. Again, we'll then ask any of them to, at this point, take over, fill in the holes of what I have not described fully or correctly, and help the town council understand where you think you would like to head. Lucas, you're not shy. Go ahead. We can't hear you, Lucas.
Lucas, you're on mute.
Lucas, you're still on mute. Yeah. There
So-
you go.
I was saying I'd like to speak to a point that Dan made earlier about we've got all these monitoring efforts going on right now. We've got groundwater. We've got a marsh vulnerability study going on. We've got tide gauges deployed. We've got weather stations on the island. So when does the point come where we actually start using that information? I think that's what this whole idea is doing. The first step is gathering what are the concerns of the community, what are those thresholds, and then we use the data that we've been collecting to explain when we're approaching one of those thresholds. What decisions do we need to make to fix a drainage issue that is causing fresh water to be pumped into a tidal creek that before was had a higher salinity? How do we find issues around the community that we might not know about yet that we can help solve just by understanding how, say, tides and groundwater, what is their mutual reaction to each other? So I think that's what the plan is really about, and definitely getting started is it's all community engagement at the very beginning.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my role here is not as content expert. I'm the facilitator of the group. Maybe some of you don't know, but I'm a trained facilitator. And so my role has been to try to figure out how to take the content that the group has worked on and these goals that they have and figure out how do we take it out to the community. So these thresholds are basically values that the community holds. How do we get that back from the community into a form so that we, the town council, KICA, can use that to form these thresholds, to form a plan, to use it as we've sort of outlined here, to use it for the future, to show people what is Kiowa about? Are we prepared to look forward, or are we sort of hiding our head and saying sea level rise is not going to impact us? The one thing I was really impressed about here is that in this plan, we're talking about not things that are sort of incredibly solid, so that there may be plans, response plans that are developed by staff that say, yes, if this happens, we know we have to do this. But there also are plans that might have to be developed that say, maybe we don't have to do anything about that. And maybe in 5 years, we have to do something about that. Or as Jim has pointed out, maybe there's new technology that comes along. So there's a lot of flexibility here. And I think that's really valuable. And maybe people don't understand that totally.
Yeah. Hey, Kathy, I have a question for you, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in both what I'll call your recommendation, option 1, and option 2. Option 2 fascinated me a little bit, only in the sense that I was wondering if you went out there with a skeleton, let's call it, would you get, and you've obviously thought about this, would you get better input from the community than if you simply went out with more of a blank sheet and said, what do you think? I'm just wondering about, obviously you've recommended 1, but why is 1 better than 2? I sort of was enthralled by option 2 a little bit.
So we had a lot of discussion about that, and Lucas and Jim and Dave, jump in here on that. But the thought is that you're not just saying to people, well, what are your concerns? You're actually giving them, the thought would be in a group, in a facilitated group, you would say to them, it would concern me if this happened because X, Y, and Z. And so you would give them an idea like that. There's a big difference when you ask a homeowner, a property owner, that kind of question, versus if you ask a staff member who doesn't live on Kiowa, who has the technical knowledge, that same kind of question. And that was why we ended up with asking homeowners that question first. That obviously takes a lot of prep and a lot of bringing them along. I think in our discussions and in the listening to people talk in various environments, I've heard an incredible amount of expertise expressed, not just in the environmental committee and in the sea level rise committee. I sat in on many of their meetings and listened to the content. There's a lot of expertise out there. So I think those kinds of individuals could help jumpstart that discussion. They already have some ideas. And these are homeowners who have a stake in what that end result is. That's different than a staff member has.
Okay. Well, that answers my question a little bit, because I think you have to seed them a little bit.
Yeah, you do.
In order to get real value out of it, or they'll be all over the map.
No, you obviously do. And that's why you need trained facilitators. So John and Dave and I met with the Sea Grant people to talk about that very issue. How could we get, that process facilitated? You're not just going to go in there and say, all right, so write down your best 10 answers.
Right,
We
yeah.
really need to have people who are trained to be able to talk with them.
I comment on that, just going back to the report that we sent in. We were suggesting an option 1 that in this prep work that Kathy's talking about, that you ask the participants to consider impacts on public infrastructure, which included stormwater management, road accessibility, community amenities, on private property, which included residence protection, landscaping resilience, property values, and the environment, which include the beach, the marsh, and the forest. So we are talking about providing some guidance instead of a free-for-all, even in option 1.
Right.
In option 2, in order to save time and effort, and maybe with COVID, I don't know, you sacrifice a little bit of that by starting out with more structure to begin with, and then you get community input with a more structured start.
And I know Jim and I have talked about this, and I've talked to John Leffler also. I mean, my own preference is kind of a made up, hybrid A1-2 because, and partly for two reasons. One, I'm more focused on getting it done by November. I mean, I want a good product, but I do think for a variety of reasons, if we're going to do this, this town council needs to see and have the ability to deal with the outcomes of that first stage. And that needs to be done by November. And I have some serious concerns about whether the full-blown A approach can be done in that time frame, particularly with some of the challenges of COVID. So to me, maybe it's a little over-engineered, but there are some important things there. So I would focus more on saying, do we all agree that whatever we get has to have stakeholder input? It has got to have input that reflects the views of our property owners, our key businesses on the island, that it needs to, in one way or another, tap into that. How they choose to do it, I'm not going to re-engineer that, so long as they can meet a time frame that this town council and the KICA board can see something in the latter part of this year that is a finished outcome of that first stage.
So your feeling is we've got to get the boat in the water by November, or it's not going to be very successful.
I think, yeah, and I have different reasons for that, partly because I'm still going to be in the boat in November, and I'd like to be in the boat when this comes in.
Okay, understand.
Yeah,
Kathy?
I got to say, I have a little bit of concern because we're talking about having, we said 48 was the number of people in a room. I don't know whether we could get 48 people to come together. We had originally talked about doing it at the new conference center.
And
I don't know
I
whether
think
we
you
could
can
get
redo
48 people to commit to that.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to moderate the approach. I mean, the answer is no,
Yeah.
you're not going to get 48, but I think you can conclude you don't need 48, and you can still get the input a different way.
Well, I would just reinforce what Craig is saying about, the best structure we can do to get the job done by the end of the year, because it's really critical while we've got the momentum that we've got on sea level rise, that we get a process of moving forward institutionalized. And I think that's the first key step to institutionalizing dealing with sea level rise in a sensible, effective way on out into the future.
I guess my question would be, what would the council be looking for exactly? Is this just going to be, you want the thresholds that we gather from residents? Is that what needs to be turned
No.
November?
That's what I was going to say. That's what I would be looking for, but I'd want to hear from the other council members.
Well, I think the value in this whole process is that we have an iterative process. If we remember the issues that came up when we talked about the road and redoing the road, and there was a question, are we going to do the additional level that's given in the sea level rise recommendations, or are we just going to do what we had planned normally? The thing about this process that I like, and I don't know, I'll wait till later on what I would recommend, is the fact that you can make management decisions now on these triggers, but you don't have to implement it immediately. You can delay and go forward, and then hopefully something else might be developed by the time you implement that you can use, some technology or some way of monitoring the flow of the water. I think that you must have done a lot on this before we got to the COVID-19 period, didn't you? I know you've been working on this for a long time.
Well, I've been working on the strategy of, like I have a whole rundown about what we would do with the people in the room, what the structure would look like, how we would ask questions. We have a list of people we might ask to come, so I got pretty far on that.
Mhm.
But I don't know how far along. And I also got thinking about what a survey might look like
Mhm.
of residents. So I got pretty far on that. I don't think that those are the meaty issues. I think Lucas's question is the key one here. What is it that the council would want to see by November so that we could make sure that whatever is produced answers that question? What is that question? Is it the end of phase 1 that says, here are the thresholds? That's sort of what we laid out. And that part of the
That's what I would-
process, how long did we say phase 1 was going to take us? I think it was 6 months, right?
Yeah, I would elaborate just a little bit on that if I could. Then that
Go ahead. Thank you.
it's gonna, we've been working a lot, we had a lot of ideas and stuff, but this phase 1 threshold identification has kind of been the holdup for us, because we really didn't want to just jam it down people's throats. We wanted to make sure that the community was on board before we went on to the other steps. It's my belief that once we have the community involvement part, phase 1 done, and we're pulling to focus the thresholds that the community is behind, we want to pay attention to, that the next steps will move pretty quickly because a lot of it will involve existing staff on the town and existing staff on Kika. And if there's a reasonable priority, not absolute priority on it, I think that the staff can move the rest of the stuff pretty rapidly during the next year. That's my view. I don't know what the other members of our group have to say about that, but.
So Jim, what you're saying is we need, so we've presented this as a joint community effort.
Yes.
It's an effort between Kika, the town council, the community members. It involves community member input, generating thresholds that's worked on by staff who have expertise.
Exactly. And consultants, maybe.
And consultants, okay. So we have lots of moving parts.
Right.
Yeah.
So Kathy, if that's true, you have one advantage right now. Everybody's kind of locked down. So they actually can focus more than they do sometimes. I'm a little concerned about your issue of if you have to do it by putting 48 people in a room, we're going to run into some real problems.
No, I don't think that's feasible.
Yeah.
In fact, Lucas and I were talking back and forth a little bit about this earlier yesterday. And, my best estimate, we couldn't maybe even think about doing something like that, posing it until January,
Right.
If then. And Craig, your time frame is a little bit different.
Yeah. Could you go to more of an online survey of some kind?
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I had proposed something like that.
Can I ask you something, Kathy? I'm sort of, I was always a little bit with Craig's version of, if you're given 2 options, let's not choose either of those because we want to be difficult, let's just choose option 1A. But let me explain here what I'm thinking. I think the original plan of getting 2 workshops of 48 or so people together, that sounds like a great idea. That just went out of the way. That went by the wayside in early March when this virus hit. So that's not going to work. I'm wondering whether the approach would not be to have staff start like forthwith developing their ideas or possible, no, not their, possible ideas for these thresholds, and then to take those as developed by staff and integrate them in a workshop or survey online or some other way. I think you probably, wouldn't we get more feedback and reaction by chosen property owners to something they actually see in front of them, rather than asking them in an online forum to start with a clean slate? I just think that might be difficult.
Well, that's kind of option 2, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's, you
We-
looked
we
at
might-
the option clause. Yeah, that's kind of number 2-ish.
Yeah, well, you know, it's possible that we might be able to do some combination of jumpstarting with staff expertise, with some kind of Zoom kind of thing with a select number of people,
Right.
develop a survey out of that that's broader to the community.
Yeah.
I think that again, we want to preserve the integrity of developing thresholds that are the values of the community. And so we want to figure out, and I have to think a little bit more about that, how to get those value statements in there. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that staff can't have values of the community, but there is something different about when you own your property and you live here and you see it every day, that's different, I think.
Right, that makes sense.
So we just gotta, I have to think a little more about how that could be done, but
I'm
and
struggling
then,
a little bit with,
so-
I'm struggling a little bit with Craig's timeframe.
You do-
well, I
you-
guess it depends on what you're expecting in November. Let's get back to that.
If I
You
was-
know, Lucas asked the most important question here. What,
As a council member, I would expect to have thresholds identified, thresholds and trigger points, and be able to relate it directly to the whole sea level rise proposal.
I like the way
And-
that this, I like the way the discussion's going, because I'm afraid that COVID-19 is going to be with us for months and months and months. And that if we don't find a way, like you're talking about, to move forward now, we're going to just lose all the steam.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have to consider COVID-19 as part of our life right now and go ahead with business.
Well,
So let me,
let me try this. Let me just throw it back at all of those of you, Lucas, all of you who've done all the work. If you could wave your magic wand and just compel council to today declare this is what we're going to do, because that's what you want, therefore we're going to do that. What would that be? What do you, let me throw this around. What do you think we should now decide and do so we keep the momentum going and so on and so forth? You've done the work, we haven't.
Mhm. I think the ask for thresholds by November is a fair one. I think with option 2, we definitely could have thresholds identified by the November timeline. Where it gets, where I foresee there being a lag is going to be getting with staff, getting their input on how, okay, well, now we have to decipher this threshold, because I imagine with community input, we may get things that we have to classify in one issue or another, right? It's not going to be a clean cut. I'm worried about salinity. It's going to be, I'm worried about the plantings in my yard. Well,
yeah,
then,
the language.
yeah, is that
Right.
issue related to groundwater salinity, or is it related to the water table, or is it related to something like tides? And then the question then is, well, which entity is going to be ultimately responsible for handling that solution, right?
but that latter question, Lucas, comes, next year or the year after. I mean, that's the question that flows out of the thresholds is, now that I know that one of my thresholds involves the health of the vegetation in the marsh, I'm making that up.
Mhm.
Then you're going to the next stage next year of, well, what are the driver, what are the triggers, what are the drivers? Is that a salinity issue? Is that a tide issue?
Right.
What are the ways that we measure that? But to me, as I understand your model for the thresholds, you're stopping short of that. I mean, you're identifying the higher level issue.
Right.
And I would, from my standpoint, love it if you could get to the threshold issue resolved by November.
November.
So
But I want to ask the
I
other
think-
council members, let me first summarize, by the fact that we're right now way down in the weeds, discussing how we would do all of this, am I correct then in assuming that there is in fact support or no objection to the overall model that this group has created, of at least trying to move forward with this concept of identifying thresholds and so on, that there is comfort with this group, along with our staff members that share these same responsibilities, of this group taking on the lead here over the next few months in helping driving this next step forward. And that if in fact you're comfortable with trying to get at least the thresholds figured out by November, letting them then have the great debate about what they need to sacrifice in the way of sophistication in order to just get it done.
Yeah, because the thing I was going to say, Craig, is that's exactly the point I was going to go to. I think our group has struggled with the fact that, as you know, we don't have a home, we don't have a validation. And I think this is an opportunity for a joint task force that between the town council and Kika, with the membership added that you deem necessary to move forward with implementing this.
Yeah. And I would only add in how you get there, and this is just I would only encourage you to sacrifice the perfect for the good.
Well, that's very obvious right now.
That's reality.
I am very adaptable with those
Let me hear
things.
from the other council members, again, where you're at.
I just have one more thing. I agree we're going to go for the trigger points and the thresholds. And the way you get them is up to you. You know what you can accomplish. I have no idea whether 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 is the best way. But I can just tell you, here's what I think as a council member I would like to see.
Okay. Next.
I'll speak. I think this is a good approach. I think the mayor has presented something that's critical, which is let's get the boat in the water if we can by November. In order to do that, I think you guys can figure out, you're going to end up probably somewhere between 1 and 2. We may have to Zoom people. We may not be able to get them in a room. We may have to do some work like that, but you guys can figure that out. In terms of support for this, and Jim, to your point, getting the thing moving is terribly critical. So I'm all in favor of that. I think you're going to end up somewhere between 1 and 2, which is great. Fine.
Klaus?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the difference between 1 and 2 is really goes to, notions of what might be perfect versus very good. And I just don't think it's relevant. I think you just have to be pragmatic about it.
Chris?
I have nothing to add. I have no objections. I support what's being discussed. No other comments.
Stephanie, like all things, we come up with this stuff that needs to get done, and then we walk back and drop it in your lap. With respect to you and Jim and others on your staff who are also involved and in supporting this, any comments or any concerns?
No, I don't have any. We just need the direction, because whatever, to do the thresholds and not have to do the triggers, I think it's fine. This committee, I believe, probably already have some ideas in terms of some thresholds. So I think getting this done by the November date doesn't seem like a leap for staff here. And then from there will be the next step, which will be next year. So I don't have any heartburn over it.
And I know that in all of our discussions, at the end of the day, I think that Kika and the Conservancy and the town specifically think that if we are actually over the long term going to successfully address what does or does not develop from sea level rise, we need to do that in tandem and in sync. So does this, Lucas, I guess since you're the actual Kika employee, does this give you enough direction and feedback in terms of where the town is for you to now engage? I know you've already had conversations with Kika to talk with them and get them equally aligned with wherever we think we're headed.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's enough direction. If there's a point of contact at the town that I need to know of to get this group started, this joint task force, then that would be, I guess that would be the last bit of information I would need.
So who, can I ask, I know I'm all about process, I'm sorry, but who is the person who's pulling us together? Who is the person who's leading us down here? Because that's one of the things that we need, direction. Who's the head of us right now?
I think that conversation's, well, I might ask you the question who you want that to be, but I think we probably need to have that conversation first with the community association also.
Okay.
To see what our options are.
And then will you let the group of us know?
Sure. Yeah. Or Diana will, somebody will.
Somebody will.
It helps us get our work done.
Okay. Does this, to the group, does this satisfy the feedback and enough direction that you hoped for out of this discussion?
Yeah, it's actually, it's better than I thought.
Okay.
I thought maybe we were looking at not starting anything till January, so I'm just gonna dust off my stuff and figure out how to change up a little bit.
Oh, ye of little faith.
No, I'm always glad to be smiling at the end of a conversation.
All right, we're gonna move on to our next agenda item. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to new business, item A, which is to consider the approval of a contract for janitorial services, and which we, prior to this meeting, had a Ways and Means committee to discuss.